Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. Working as a gravedigger was never my plan, but when life hits you and you run out of options, you end up doing anything for money. It was not a complicated job. Digging graves, burying the dead, making sure the headstones were properly placed. During the day, the cemetery was a quiet, almost peaceful place. But at night, that place became something more. Something I would have never imagined. They offered me the night shift because no one else wanted it. The other gravediggers called it the cursed shift. They said that at night, the cemetery was filled with things that did not belong to this world. At first I laughed at his stories. I thought they were just silly superstitions, old stories to scare newbies. But it wasn't long before I realized something was strange. Something that felt wrong in that place. It all started in my third week. It was a cold night. The wind blew hard through the trees in the cemetery, and the sound of dry leaves dragging along the ground made everything seem more sinister. I was digging a grave for a burial that would take place the next day when, suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It was a soft sound, like someone shuffling between graves. I turned around suddenly, thinking that some animal had sneaked into the place, but there was no one. I took a deep breath and tried to continue with my work. I didn't want to let my mind play tricks on me, but as I was digging, the sound came back. Closer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine, and when I looked up, I saw him. On the other side of the cemetery, among the old, neglected tombstones, there was a figure standing next to a tree. I couldn't see his face clearly. He was shrouded in shadows, but I knew he was watching me. I felt his heavy gaze on me. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, not knowing what to do, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding, and as much as I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't the first time he saw something strange, but never as clear as that night. Days passed, and things got stranger. I started hearing whispers every time I worked at night. At first they were soft, almost imperceptible, but little by little they became stronger. It seemed like they were coming from the ground, as if someone was talking underground. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I felt like they were calling me. One night, while I was walking among the graves checking that everything was in order, I noticed that one of the headstones was out of place. It was impossible. I had secured it myself the day before. I went over to check it, and when I crouched down, I felt something strange in the ground. The ground was softer than normal, as if someone had recently finished. I grabbed the shovel I had with me and started digging, hoping it was just a bad fit. What I found left me cold. A few centimeters below the surface, I found a hand. A pale, cold human hand protruding from the earth. My stomach turned. It was as if someone had been buried alive. But when I touched the hand, it was stiff. She was dead. I stepped back suddenly, and at that moment the wind picked up strongly. The branches of the trees began to creak, and the shadows of the graves seemed to lengthen towards me. The whisper returned, clearer this time. You shouldn't have touched her. I stood up quickly with the shovel still in my hands, looking around, but there was no one. Just me and the graves. I ran towards the small cabin, where we kept the tools. My refuge when something made me nervous. I locked myself in there, shaking, trying to understand what the hell was happening, but that night didn't end there. Just when the clock struck 3 in the morning, the sound began. Hits. At first I thought they were coming from the door, but no. The blows came from the ground. Something, or someone, was knocking from beneath the ground as if it wanted to come out. I wasn't alone. Panic overwhelmed me. I took the flashlight and left the cabin determined to get out of there. I didn't care about work. I didn't care about anything. But when I was about to cross the fence, I saw him again. The figure. The same one he had seen days ago. This time it was closer, right on the path between the tombs. It didn't move. He just looked at me. My legs refused to move. Fear had me trapped, and then the figure began to walk towards me with slow and unnatural movements. He seemed to float more than walk, and his presence made the air around me turn ice cold. What do you want? I screamed with a voice broken by terror. The figure stopped, and for the first time I could see its face, or what was left of it. He was a man, or had been one, but his skin was dry and stretched, as if he had been buried for years. His eyes were dark and empty, and his mouth moved slowly but made no sound. He was like a broken puppet, controlled by invisible strings. "Help us," he said with a voice that didn't sound human. I didn't stay to listen to the rest. I ran like I had never run before, zigzagging between the tombstones, with the feeling that that thing was following me. The whispering didn't stop. It felt in my head like someone was speaking directly into my mind. "Help us, we are trapped." I arrived at the cemetery gate. I flung it open and didn't look back. My breathing was rapid and uncontrolled, but I didn't stop until I reached my house. That night I didn't sleep. I knew that whatever I had seen wouldn't leave me alone. The next morning I tried to quit. I went to talk to the supervisor, a man I had never paid much attention to, but who seemed to know more than he was letting on. I told him what had happened, expecting him to laugh at me or tell me I was crazy, but instead he stared at me with a serious expression. "You're not the first," he said, "and you won't be the last." I asked him to explain, but he just shook his head. "This cemetery has more history than you imagine. Some graves should never have been opened, but there is always someone who does it." "What were those things?" I asked, desperate for an explanation. The supervisor sighed. "They are not ghosts, they are not spirits, they are trapped souls. Something keeps them here. Maybe it's the place, or maybe something worse. But once you see them, they won't leave you alone. You can't run away from them." That was the last time I saw him. I left town that same week, leaving work, my house, everything. I tried to start over, but something changed in me. Every night I wake up at 3 in the morning for no apparent reason, and every time I do, I hear that whisper, "Help us." The cemetery didn't let me go. And even though I'm far from that cursed place, I know that sooner or later they will come back for me. Because when you open a grave that you shouldn't, the dead don't leave you alone. Before continuing, if you enjoy my content, leave your like, subscribe, and tell me at what time you dare to listen to these macabres. Now, without further interruptions, let's continue. Ready for the next story? Working in a cemetery was never something that appealed to me, but sometimes life puts you in strange places. It was the only job offer I had gotten after months of searching. "It's not that big of a deal," he told me. "Just dig, bury, and keep the place clean." What I didn't know was that there was something else in that cemetery. Something that didn't stay underground. The cemetery was old, very old. There were graves more than 100 years old. Some covered in moss, almost forgotten. The leaning and broken tombstones gave the place an appearance of total abandonment, as if even the dead had been forgotten by time. My partner, Don Matthias, was a reserved, older guy who had worked there for decades. He trained me for the first few weeks, showing me the basics. How to dig graves, how to mark graves, and of course, how to keep everything in order. What he didn't tell me at first was that, in that cemetery, order was the most important thing. Don Matthias didn't talk much, but every time night approached, his attitude changed. He became more tense, and he always told me the same thing. "Don't stay after 6. I thought it was because, well, it's a cemetery. Anyone would be uncomfortable in the dark, surrounded by graves. But there was something about the way he said it, the way he looked at the older headstones, that made me uneasy, like he knew something I didn't. One afternoon, while we were arranging some tomes in the oldest sector, Don Matthias told me the story. "This place has its own way of punishing those who don't respect the rules," he said as he placed flowers on an old grave. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling like something wasn't right. "There have been others here before you and me," he responded without looking at me. "Grave diggers. Young people who believed that this place was just a pile of dirt and stones. But this cemetery has a curse, and that curse, boy, is real." I laughed nervously, hoping he was kidding me, but his face remained serious, his eyes fixed on one grave in particular. I didn't say anything else. I didn't want to seem scared, but that afternoon I felt like the air in the cemetery was heavier, denser. The tomb that Don Matthias pointed out belonged to a former gravedigger. I had never heard of him, but his tombstone was broken and looked older than the others, as if time had been crueler to him. Don Matthias did not want to tell me more, and during the following weeks I tried to forget what he had told me. However, everything changed one night when I stayed late. It was the funeral of a man who had died suddenly, and his family insisted that we bury him at sunset. It was almost 6 o'clock when I finished covering the coffin with earth. Don Matthias had already left. "Don't stay after 6. I remembered that he had warned me, but the job had to be done. The sun was already setting when I felt a strange cold run down my back, something that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was more like the air had changed, like something was watching me. I tried to finish as quickly as possible, and just as I was putting in the last shovelful of dirt, I heard a noise. A crunch. At first I thought it was the wind through the tree branches, but then I heard it again, louder. It was a hollow sound, as if something underground was moving. I stood motionless, with the shovel still in my hand. The sound came from the grave he had just buried. "No way," I muttered to myself, trying to convince myself that I wasn't hearing what I believed. But the creaking continued, clearer now, more insistent. It was as if someone, was scratching from inside the grave. Panic began to settle in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs didn't respond. The sound became louder, and suddenly, the earth that had just been placed moved. As if something underneath was trying to get out. I dropped the shovel and stepped back, trembling. The earth kept moving. It wasn't my imagination. It hadn't been a hallucination. Something beneath that grave was moving, pushing up, trying to break free. He was not alone in that cemetery. I ran towards the exit of the cemetery without looking back. My breathing was rapid and uncontrolled, and cold sweat covered my forehead. I didn't stop until I reached the shed where we kept the tools. I slammed the door and tried to calm down. But then from outside, I heard footsteps. Slow, dragged, but clearly human. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped right in front of the booth. I approached the window with my heart in my throat and looked out. I saw it. Among the shadows of the tombs, a tall and thin figure stood. He looked like a man, but his skin was dirty, and his face had no eyes. There were only two dark gaps where they should be. He was looking towards me, or at least that's what it seemed like. My entire body was shaking. I knew he wasn't human. I couldn't do it. Suddenly, the door of the shed began to shake violently, as if something was trying to get in. I leaned back, breathing hard. I couldn't let him in. He knew that if he did, he wouldn't get out of there alive. "Get out!" I screamed, fear ripping through my voice. The knocking stopped suddenly. Everything was silent. The air became heavy, oppressive, and for a few seconds nothing happened. But when I turned the lock to open the door, something stopped me. From the other side, a low, barely audible whisper filtered through the wood. "No. Did you see yourself? Stay." My hands shook. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, and at that moment I understood it. The curse that Don Matias spoke of was real. It wasn't just an empty warning. Gravediggers who broke the rules paid the price. The footsteps began again, but this time they didn't go away. They came from the ground right under my feet, as if something was walking underground, getting closer and closer. I rushed towards the door, throwing it open, and running towards the exit of the cemetery. As I ran, I could hear the footsteps behind me getting faster, closer. I didn't know what was following me, but I felt its presence. It was as if the cemetery itself had come to life to trap me. I crossed the entrance gate and didn't stop running until I reached my house. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper in my head. You shouldn't have stayed. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery, determined to speak with Don Matias. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening to me. But when I arrived, something wasn't right. His booth was closed, and no one had seen him since the night before. I asked the other workers, but no one had clear answers. It was as if the earth had swallowed him. My mind filled with images of that empty-eyed figure, and a terrifying idea took hold of me. Had it been Don Matias? Was it him, the figure that had followed me that night? I looked for him among the graves, but I never found him. Only one more grave appeared in the oldest section of the cemetery, a broken and moss-covered tombstone, with Don Matias's name engraved on it. And then I understood it. The cemetery takes its gravediggers. It consumes us. It drags us into its shadows. And now, every time night falls, I know my time is running out too. Because in this place, once you break the rules, you never get out.